Welcome to this journey into the shadows of American history, where the line between justice and vengeance, between the living and the dead, becomes impossibly thin. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Are you alone? Are the lights on? This story demands to be heard in the quiet hours, when the weight of the past feels closest. I'm grateful you're here with us today, because what we're about to explore together is not just a story of mysterious deaths or unexplained prophecies. It's a story about memory, about trauma that refuses to die, about voices that history tried to silence. The year is 1891. The place is rural Alabama, in the heart of what was once the Confederate South. The Civil War has been over for more than 2 decades. Slavery has been abolished. Freedom has been declared. But in the isolated communities scattered across the Alabama countryside, freedom is a word with very little meaning. In the autumn of that year, in a forgotten corner of Jefferson County, something happened that would never be fully explained. Something that would be documented in scattered newspaper reports, in terrified letters, in official investigations that went nowhere, and in whispered stories passed down through generations. It began with a man named Samuel Hodge. Samuel was 47 years old in 1891. He had been born into slavery on the Whitlock Plantation in 1844, had spent his entire childhood and young adulthood in bondage, working the cotton fields under the brutal Alabama sun. He had survived the war, had witnessed the promises of Reconstruction, and had watched those promises crumble into dust. By 1891, Samuel was still living on the same land where he had been enslaved, still working the same fields, still dependent on the same family that had once owned him. Freedom, for Samuel and dozens of others like him, meant only that they now paid rent for their cabins and received meager wages instead of nothing at all. Samuel was known as a quiet man, respectful, hard-working, deeply religious. He attended services at the small church that served the black community, sang hymns in a low, steady voice, and kept largely to himself, until October 15th, 1891. On that day, Samuel Hodge walked into the center of the small gathering of homes and churches that formed the community's heart. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth. His wife, Eliza, who had tried to stop him from leaving their cabin that morning, followed behind him, her face twisted with worry. What happened next was witnessed by more than 30 people. Samuel unwrapped the object he was carrying. It appeared to be a wooden box, small and ancient-looking, carved with symbols that no one recognized. He placed it on the ground in front of the church steps. And then Samuel Hodge began to speak. He spoke of visions, of voices, of ancestors who would not rest. He spoke of injustices that had soaked into the very soil of the plantation, of blood that cried out from the ground, of debts that remained unpaid. And then, in a voice that witnesses described as not quite his own, Samuel announced 12 names, 12 people who would die. He gave their names clearly. He gave the dates of their deaths. He described in disturbing detail how each death would occur. The crowd that had gathered stared at him in stunned silence. Some laughed nervously. Others made the sign of the cross. The Reverend Josiah Carter, the young preacher who led the community's spiritual life, stepped forward and tried to calm Samuel, suggesting he was ill, that he needed rest. But Samuel's eyes were clear. His voice was steady. "I have seen it," he said simply. "The 12 have been marked. It has begun." 3 days later, the first person on Samuel's list died, exactly as he had predicted. And with that death, the Whitlock Plantation became the center of a nightmare that would grip the entire region, attract investigators from as far away as Mobile and Montgomery, and create a mystery that remains unsolved to this very day. What was Samuel Hodge? a murderer with the elaborate plan, a genuine prophet touched by something beyond our understanding, a man driven mad by decades of trauma? Or was he something else entirely, a vessel for forces that we cannot name, carrying out a terrible justice that the living world had refused to deliver? To understand what happened at Whitlock Plantation in 1891, we must first understand what that place was and what it represented. The Whitlock family had established their plantation in 1823, when Alabama was still a frontier territory. By the 1850s, Whitlock Plantation had grown to encompass more than 3,000 acres of prime cotton-growing land, worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. The plantation had been run by Nathaniel Whitlock, a man described in historical records as stern but fair. A description that, we must understand, comes from documents written by white observers who saw nothing wrong with owning other human beings. The reality, as preserved in the few surviving accounts from enslaved people themselves, was far darker. Whitlock Plantation had a reputation, even among other plantations, for harsh discipline. There was a building referred to only as the shed in period documents, where enslaved people who violated rules were taken for punishment. The details of what happened in that shed were never officially recorded, but they were remembered. There was a cemetery for enslaved people on the plantation's eastern edge, marked only by rough wooden crosses and stones. No names were recorded, no dates preserved. It was, like so much of that history, a place of deliberate erasure. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Nathaniel Whitlock was dead, killed during Sherman's march through the South. His son, Thomas Whitlock, Jr., returned from the war to find a changed world. The plantation was in ruins. The enslaved people were free. The economic system that had made his family wealthy had collapsed. But Thomas Whitlock Jr. was a shrewd man. He understood that while slavery was legally dead, economic dependency could achieve many of the same results. He offered the newly freed people a deal. They could stay on the land, rent cabins, work the fields for wages. Where else would they go? How would they survive? Most had never known any other home. Their families were buried in that unmarked cemetery. Their entire lives had been contained within those 3,000 acres. And so, many stayed, including Samuel Hodge. By 1891, the Whitlock Plantation existed in a strange twilight state. Legally, it was a collection of tenant farms. In practice, it functioned much as it always had. The Whitlock family still owned the land, still controlled the store where workers bought their supplies on credit, still held power over every aspect of daily life. The community that lived there was tightly knit, but fractured by trauma. There were older people like Samuel who remembered slavery in vivid detail. There were younger people born after emancipation who had never known chains but had inherited their parents' fear and pain. There were children who played in the same fields where their grandparents had worked themselves to death. Tensions in the broader South were rising. Reconstruction had failed. Jim Crow laws were being implemented across the region. Lynchings were increasing. The brief hope of true equality had given way to a new system of oppression, in many ways as brutal as what had come before. In this environment, religion became everything. The small church that served the black community was the one place where people could speak freely, could express grief and rage and hope, could imagine a justice that the earthly world refused to provide. Samuel Hodge was a deacon at that church. He led prayers. He read from the Bible in a slow, careful voice, tracing each word with his finger. He had taught himself to read in secret during slavery, a crime that could have cost him his life. His wife, Eliza, was the community's midwife and healer. She knew herbs and roots, traditional medicine passed down from her mother and grandmother. She had delivered most of the children born in the community over the past 20 years. She was respected, even feared a little, for her knowledge of things that doctors did not understand. The Hodges had lost 3 children to illness and malnutrition during slavery. They had one surviving daughter, Ruth, who had moved to Birmingham to work as a domestic servant, escaping the plantation that had consumed her parents' lives. Samuel never spoke of his time in slavery, except once. The Reverend Josiah Carter, in a letter written years later, recalled Samuel telling him, "There are things done in the dark that God has seen. There are debts written in a book that only the dead can read." It was in early October 1891 that Samuel's behavior began to change. Several people reported seeing him walking near the old slave cemetery at odd hours, standing among the unmarked graves as if listening to something. His wife told others that he was having nightmares, waking in the middle of the night, speaking in tongues she did not recognize. On October 12th, 3 days before his public announcement, Samuel failed to show up for work in the fields. Workers sent to check on him found him digging near the cemetery's edge, his hands and bloody, his clothes covered in dirt. When they asked what he was doing, he simply said, "Looking for what was hidden." He had found something, the small wooden box that he would later display in public. Where it came from, what it truly was, has never been determined. Descriptions from witnesses suggest it was carved from dark wood, covered in symbols that might have been African in origin or might have been something else entirely. When Eliza saw the box, she begged Samuel to bury it again, to leave it alone. She told neighbors that the box felt wrong, that it radiated something cold and ancient. But Samuel refused. It was meant to be found, he told her. It was waiting for the right time. The historical record gives us facts, dates, names. It tells us about economic systems and legal structures. It documents the aftermath of slavery in dry, bureaucratic language. But it cannot tell us what Samuel Hodge truly experienced in those October days. It cannot explain the certainty in his voice when he announced the 12 deaths. It cannot account for what happened next. We can only examine the evidence, follow the trail of documented deaths, and try to understand how an entire community became convinced that they were witnessing something beyond the natural world, a reckoning that had been building for generations, finally breaking through into reality. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether we believe in prophecy or supernatural justice. The question is, what really happened at Whitlock Plantation in the autumn of 1891, and why has the truth remained buried for more than a century? Clara May Johnson was 29 years old. She worked as a cook in the Whitlock household, a position that placed her in an uncomfortable space between the black community and the white family that employed her. She was known for her discretion, her skill in the kitchen, and her quiet ambition to save enough money to leave Alabama entirely. According to Samuel Hodge's prophecy, delivered on October 15th, Clara May would die on October 18th at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, from a fall that would break her neck. The announcement had been met with mixed reactions. Some dismissed Samuel as a man who had finally cracked under the weight of his traumatic past. Others were disturbed, but skeptical. A few believed him immediately, though they would not admit this publicly. Clara May herself laughed when she heard about the prophecy. She told friends that Samuel had always been strange, and that working the fields for 50 years under the sun could make any man lose his mind. She went about her work as usual, showing no fear, no concern. On October 18th, she reported to the Whitlock house at dawn, as she did every morning. The day's menu was recorded in the household ledger that has been preserved. She was preparing a roast for dinner, baking bread, making preserves from the last of the autumn apples. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Clara May was seen carrying a basket of laundry up the stairs to the second floor of the house. The stairs were wooden, worn smooth by decades of use, but not dangerous. Clara May had climbed them thousands of times before. At 4:15, a scream brought several people running into the house. Clara May Johnson lay at the bottom of the stairs, her neck bent at an impossible angle, her eyes still open, staring at nothing. The basket of laundry was scattered around her body, white sheets slowly soaking up the blood that pooled beneath her head. She was dead. The local doctor, summoned from town, estimated time of death at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly as Samuel had predicted. The doctor's official report, filed with the county records and preserved to this day, ruled the death accidental. Clara May had slipped on the stairs, lost her balance, fallen. A tragic accident. Nothing more. But witnesses who had seen her body told a different story. They spoke of the expression on her face, not surprise or fear, but something else. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. And they spoke of something else, something that was never included in the official report. Marks on Clara May's ankles, faint but visible, as if something had gripped her legs and pulled. The community erupted in panic and confusion. People remembered Samuel's prophecy with new clarity, remembered the 11 other names he had announced. The Reverend Carter tried to calm his congregation, preaching about coincidence and the danger of superstition, but his words rang hollow. Samuel himself said nothing. He attended Clara May's funeral, stood silently at the grave, and when people approached him with questions, he only repeated, "I have seen it. It has begun." Thomas Whitlock Jr. was furious. He blamed Samuel for creating hysteria, for disturbing the peace of his plantation, for filling people's heads with dangerous nonsense. He considered having Samuel arrested, but the local sheriff advised against it. What crime had been committed? Predicting a death that then occurred. That was not illegal, only strange. The second name on Samuel's list was Isaac Freeman, a field worker who was 63 years old. According to the prophecy, Isaac would die on October 27th by drowning. Isaac Freeman had lived his entire life in Alabama and had never learned to swim. He avoided water carefully, never going near the creek that ran through the plantation's northern edge. When he heard Samuel's prophecy, he became terrified. He refused to work in any field near water. He would not even drink from the communal well, asking others to bring him water in sealed containers. October 27th came. Isaac stayed in his cabin all day, refusing to come out despite the beautiful autumn weather. His friends checked on him regularly, reassuring him, bringing him food. At sunset, people began to relax. October 27th was nearly over. Samuel's second prophecy, it seemed, would not come true. Then, at 8 o'clock that evening, screams rang out from Isaac Freeman's cabin. Witnesses found him collapsed on his cabin floor, unresponsive. His face was pale, his lips blue. His lungs were filled with water. The doctor who examined the body was baffled. Isaac Freeman had drowned, but there was no water in the cabin except for a small bucket in the corner, containing perhaps a gallon. There was no way he could have drowned in it, even if he had tried. Yet the evidence was undeniable. His lungs were saturated with water, exactly as if he had drowned in a deep river. The official cause of death was listed as unexplained internal affliction. But everyone who saw the body knew what they had witnessed. Isaac Freeman had drowned on dry land, exactly as Samuel Hodge had predicted. Now the panic became genuine terror. People began to examine Samuel's list of 12 names with desperate intensity. Some of the names were expected, older people, or those with known health problems, but others were young, healthy, with no obvious risk factors, and the predicted methods of death ranged from the plausible to the seemingly impossible. The third name was Margaret Whitlock, Thomas Whitlock Jr.'s own sister, aged 48. According to Samuel, she would die on November 3rd by her own hand, though she had no history of melancholy or disturbed thoughts. Margaret herself was skeptical but shaken. She was a devout Christian woman, active in the White Methodist Church in town, known for her charitable work. The idea that she would commit self-murder was absurd. Thomas Whitlock Jr. demanded that Samuel be arrested immediately. The sheriff, under pressure, took Samuel into custody on charges of public disturbance and threatening behavior. But holding him in jail required formal charges, and no prosecutor could determine what crime to charge him with. Samuel sat in his cell, calm and quiet, reading from a Bible that Reverend Carter had brought him. When asked how he knew what he knew, he gave the same answer every time. "The box showed me, the ancestors spoke." Meanwhile, people began investigating Samuel's background, looking for some rational explanation. Had he been planning murders? Did he have accomplices? Was this an elaborate revenge plot against the Whitlock family and others? But Samuel had no history of violence. He had never been in trouble with the law. He had no obvious motive. His life was an open book, decades of hard work, quiet faith, and simple survival. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe Samuel is truly seeing the future? Or is something else at work here? Are we witnessing prophecy or a carefully planned series of murders? Share your theories with our community. On November 3rd, Margaret Whitlock was found dead in her parlor, a bottle of laudanum beside her chair, her final letter explaining that she could not bear the weight of her family's sins, that the ghosts of enslaved people haunted her waking hours, that death was preferable to the crushing guilt she carried. She had taken her own life exactly as prophesied. The sheriff released Samuel from jail. There was no evidence he had been involved in any of the deaths. He had been in custody when Margaret died. Whatever was happening, it seemed beyond human agency. Samuel returned to his cabin and waited for the next death to arrive on schedule. As November progressed, investigators from Mobile arrived at the plantation. The case had attracted attention in the regional newspapers. Headlines screamed, "Negro prophet predicts deaths with uncanny accuracy," and "Mysterious deaths plague Alabama plantation." The stories were sensationalized, often racist in their portrayal of Samuel and the black community, but they brought outside scrutiny to events that the local authorities would have preferred to keep quiet. Detective William Marsh, a 41-year-old investigator with experience in unusual cases, took charge of the inquiry. His reports, preserved in the Alabama State Archives, provide our most detailed account of what happened during those terrible months. Marsh interviewed Samuel extensively. His notes describe Samuel as intelligent and articulate, showing no signs of insanity or deception. When pressed about how he knew what would happen, Samuel always gave the same explanation. He had found the wooden box near the slave cemetery, had opened it, and had been overwhelmed by visions of the 12 deaths. Marsh examined the box himself. His description: a container of unknown origin, approximately 8 inches in length, carved from very old wood, possibly cypress. Covered in symbols that Professor Hendricks of the University of Alabama suggests may be West African in origin, though he cannot identify the specific culture or meaning. The interior is lined with what appears to be human hair and contains a folded piece of paper covered in writing that I cannot decipher. The paper was sent to experts, but no one could translate the writing. It appeared to be a mixture of symbols, letters from various alphabets, and pictographic elements. One scholar suggested it might be a form of plantation-era code that enslaved people had used to communicate in secret. Meanwhile, the 4th death occurred on November 12th. James Patterson, a white overseer who worked for the Whitlock family, died exactly as predicted. Kicked in the head by a horse he had worked with for years, an animal known for its gentle temperament. Witnesses said the horse had seemed calm one moment, then had suddenly reared up and struck Patterson with both hooves, crushing his skull. After Patterson's death, Marsh began to notice something significant. The 12 people on Samuel's list were not random. Each of them had a connection to the plantation's dark history. Clara May Johnson had been the granddaughter of a woman who had died in the shed after a severe beating in 1858. Isaac Freeman's father had been sold away from the plantation in 1851, separated from his family, never seen again. Margaret Whitlock had grown up in the plantation house, had been served by enslaved people, had participated in a system of casual cruelty that she had never questioned until Samuel's prophecy forced her to confront it. James Patterson had worked at the plantation since the 1870s and was known for his harsh treatment of black workers, carrying on the traditions of the slavery era. The pattern suggested something deliberate. Not random deaths, but specific targets, a list of the guilty and the complicit. Detective Marsh's investigation took him into the plantation's past. He obtained what few records still existed from the slavery era, ledgers documenting purchases of enslaved people, punishment records, death registrations. What he found was disturbing even by the standards of that brutal institution. Between 1850 and 1865, more than 40 enslaved people had died on the Whitlock Plantation. The official causes varied: fever, accident, childbirth complications, but the mortality rate was significantly higher than surrounding plantations. Several of the deaths were noted simply as punishment excessive. Marsh interviewed elderly people in both the black and white communities, asking about the plantation's reputation. A pattern emerged of systemic cruelty, of punishments that went beyond even the horrific norms of slavery. One elderly black woman, whose name Marsh recorded only as Aunt Bessie, told him about the night of the fire. In 1862, 3 enslaved men had attempted to escape. They were caught, brought back, and taken to the shed. What happened next was spoken of only in whispers, but the screams that came from that building were heard across the plantation. When it was over, the bodies were burned and buried in unmarked graves. Samuel Hodge's father had been one of those 3 men. This information changed the investigation's trajectory. Suddenly, Samuel had a motive. This was not prophecy, but revenge, a carefully planned series of murders designed to look like fulfillment of supernatural predictions. But the evidence did not support this theory. Samuel had alibis for most of the deaths. He had been in custody when Margaret Whitlock died. He had been in the fields, surrounded by witnesses, when Clara May fell down the stairs. The manner of Isaac Freeman's death, drowning on dry land, seemed impossible to fake. Marsh was forced to consider possibilities he had never entertained before. Was there something genuine to Samuel's claims? Could trauma and injustice create forces that operated outside natural law? He wrote in his personal journal, "I am a man of science and reason. I do not believe in ghosts or curses. Yet I cannot explain what I have witnessed. The deaths occur exactly as predicted, in ways that seem to defy rational explanation. If this is murder, it is murder, by means unknown to modern science." The 5th death occurred on November 20th, the 6th on November 28th. Each one unfolded exactly as Samuel had described, with details that seemed impossible for anyone to control or predict. The community was fracturing under the strain. Some white residents wanted Samuel hanged, convinced he was a murderer using some kind of trickery. Some black residents saw him as a prophet delivering divine justice. Others in both communities were simply terrified, wanting the nightmare to end. As December arrived, a local historian named Dr. Eleanor Briggs became involved in the case. She had been studying plantation records throughout the South, documenting the experiences of enslaved people. The events at Whitlock Plantation attracted her attention. Dr. Briggs discovered something that Detective Marsh had missed. In the county records office, buried in a box of miscellaneous documents from the Civil War era, She found a journal kept by a plantation overseer named Joshua Griggs, who had worked at Whitlock Plantation from 1855 to 1863. The journal was extraordinary, a detailed, horrifying account of daily life on the plantation. Griggs wrote with a disturbing casualness about punishments he inflicted, about enslaved people he regarded as animals, about the absolute power he held over human lives. But what caught Dr. Briggs's attention was an entry from 1861. Griggs described discovering that a group of enslaved people were practicing heathen rituals in the woods near the cemetery. He described finding a wooden box containing devilish symbols and papers covered in African witchcraft. Griggs confiscated the box and turned it over to Nathaniel Whitlock, who ordered the people involved punished severely. The box was supposedly buried somewhere on the plantation grounds, hidden away where it could cause no more trouble. Could this be the same box Samuel had found 30 years later? Dr. Briggs investigated further. She interviewed descendants of people who had been enslaved at Whitlock, collecting oral histories that had never been written down. She heard stories about the enslaved community's spiritual practices, about how they had maintained African traditions in secret, about ways they had tried to protect themselves in a world that offered no protection. One story, told by an elderly man named Joseph Turner, was particularly relevant. He said his grandmother had told him about a justice box, a container created by enslaved people that was supposed to record the names of those who had done great evil. According to the legend, when the time was right, when someone with the gift opened the box, those names would be revealed and justice would be delivered. Joseph's grandmother had told him, "The ancestors are patient. They can wait, but they do not forget, and they do not forgive." Was Samuel Hodge that person with the gift? Had he truly received visions from ancestors demanding justice? Or was the box simply a trigger, an object that connected him to a history of pain so deep that it manifested as prophetic certainty? Dr. Briggs wrote in her research notes, "We are dealing here with something that exists at the intersection of history, trauma, and belief. Whether the deaths are caused by supernatural forces or by the power of collective conviction made manifest, I cannot say. What I can say is that Samuel Hodge is channeling something real, the accumulated rage and grief of generations." By mid-December, 7 of the 12 predicted deaths had occurred. The remaining 5 names on the list lived in constant terror. Some had left the area entirely, fleeing to other states. Others had hired guards or locked themselves in their homes. But the deaths continued on schedule, regardless of precautions taken. The 8th victim, Henry Coleman, was a 45-year-old man who had worked as a driver for the Whitlock family. According to the prophecy, he would die on December 18th from a severing of the body. Terrified by the specificity of this prediction, Henry had barricaded himself in his home, far from any sharp implements or dangerous machinery. Friends stayed with him around the clock, ensuring nothing could harm him. On the evening of December 18th, Henry was sitting by his fireplace, surrounded by 3 other men, all of them armed and watchful. At 9 o'clock, he stood up to add wood to the fire. A support beam in the ceiling, which had been solid for decades, suddenly gave way. The heavy timber fell directly onto Henry Coleman, striking him at the neck and shoulder, the impact so violent that witnesses later said it nearly separated his head from his body. The official report called it a structural failure, a tragic accident. But those who were present said the beam had shown no signs of weakness. It had simply fallen at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. Detective Marsh, who had examined the scene, wrote, "I can find no rational explanation. The beam was solid. There was no rot, no insect damage, no reason for it to fail. It is as if the house itself conspired to fulfill the prophecy." Thomas Whitlock, Jr. was the 9th name on the list. His predicted death date was December 28th. The prophecy stated he would die by fire, consumed by flames that could not be extinguished. Thomas Whitlock had become a broken man. He had watched his sister die, had seen his employees and neighbors die one by one. He had tried everything, bringing in priests to bless the property, hiring armed guards, even attempting to negotiate with Samuel, offering him money and land if he would take back the curse. Samuel had simply looked at him and said, "This is not mine to take back. I am only the messenger." On December 27th, Thomas Whitlock ordered every fireplace, every lamp, every possible source of flame removed from his house. He surrounded himself with water barrels. He had men watching him constantly. On December 28th at noon, Thomas Whitlock spontaneously caught fire. Witnesses described it as impossible. One moment he was sitting in his chair. The next moment, flames were erupting from inside his body as if his blood itself was burning. The guards threw water on him, smothered him with blankets, but the fire would not be extinguished. It burned with an intensity that seemed supernatural, consuming Thomas Whitlock entirely within minutes. The doctor who examined the remains could offer no explanation. The body had been burned far more thoroughly than should have been possible in such a short time. And the fire had damaged nothing else, not the chair he sat in, not the floor beneath him, nothing but Thomas Whitlock himself. By the end of December 1891, 9 of the 12 predicted deaths had occurred. 3 names remained on Samuel's list. A young woman named Rebecca Stiles, who was to die on January 7th, an elderly man named Moses Grant, predicted to die on January 14th, and Samuel Hodge himself, who had announced that he would die on January 21st, the final name on his own prophecy. The community waited in horrified anticipation for the final 3 deaths, for the completion of whatever terrible process had been set in motion when Samuel Hodge opened that wooden box. The events of late 1891 and early 1892 at Whitlock Plantation became a local legend, whispered about but rarely discussed openly. The official records were sparse and often contradictory. Detective Marsh's investigation was never formally closed, simply abandoned as inexplicable. But the story did not end with the 12 deaths. In 1953, a professor of folklore from the University of Alabama named Dr. Robert Hawthorne was researching supernatural beliefs in rural southern communities. While interviewing elderly residents in Jefferson County, he encountered a woman named Dorothy Hodge Carter, who was 83 years old. Dorothy identified herself as the granddaughter of Samuel Hodge. She told Dr. Hawthorne that she had been only 16 years old when her grandfather died, but she remembered him clearly. She had inherited a trunk that belonged to him, containing his few possessions. Among them were several items that Dr. Hawthorne found remarkable. First was a journal, written in Samuel's careful handwriting, documenting the events of 1891. The journal had been damaged by water and age, many pages illegible, but what remained was extraordinary. Samuel described finding the box on October 12th. He wrote, "When I opened it, I was no longer in this world. I stood in a place of shadows, and the dead were there. My father was there. All those who had suffered were there. They showed me what must be done. They gave me the names. They told me I would be the final sacrifice, the one who would close the circle." The journal contained detailed descriptions of each person on the list and their connections to the plantation's violent history. It was not a record of murders Samuel planned to commit, but a documentation of justice he believed the dead had decreed. Dr. Hawthorne asked Dorothy if she believed her grandfather had truly seen visions. She responded, "I believe he saw something. Whether it came from God, or the ancestors, or from inside his own tortured soul, I cannot say. But I know this. Every death happened exactly as he said it would, and I know that my grandfather was the gentlest man I ever knew, incapable of harming anyone. Whatever force moved through him, it was not his own." Dorothy also showed Dr. Hawthorne a collection of newspaper clippings she had preserved. Articles from the Mobile Register, the Birmingham Age Herald, and smaller local papers, all documenting the strange deaths at Whitlock Plantation. The coverage had been extensive in late 1891, then had abruptly stopped in early 1892, as if someone had ordered the story suppressed. One clipping, dated January 10th, 1892, reported the death of Rebecca Stiles on January 7th, exactly as prophesied. She had died from a sudden illness described as brain fever, collapsing while walking to church. The article noted that this was the 10th death-matching predictions made by the Negro prophet Samuel Hodge. Another clipping, badly faded, documented the death of Moses Grant on January 14th. He had been 92 years old, one of the oldest people in the county, a former overseer at Whitlock Plantation during the 1850s. His death was attributed to natural causes, though witnesses reported that he had spent his final days screaming about hands pulling him down into the earth. But the most significant item Dorothy showed Dr. Hawthorne was a letter written in a shaky hand dated January 20th, 1892. It was addressed to Samuel's wife, Eliza, though it appeared she had never sent it to anyone. Perhaps it had been meant only as a record. The letter described Samuel's final day. He had woken before dawn, dressed in his best clothes, and told Eliza, "Today it ends. The debt is paid. The circle closes." He had walked to the church, where Reverend Carter was waiting. Samuel had asked the Reverend to witness what would happen, to document it, so that someone would know the truth. At noon on January 21st, with Reverend Carter and several other community members present, Samuel Hodge sat down on the church steps. He placed the wooden box beside him. He folded his hands in his lap, and then, according to Eliza's letter, he simply stopped. His heart ceased beating, his breath ended. There was no struggle, no pain. He looked peaceful, as if finally released from a great burden. The doctor who examined Samuel's body could find no cause of death. His heart was healthy, his lungs were clear. He had simply died at exactly the moment he had predicted, as if his life had been a contract that had reached its expiration. Dr. Hawthorne asked Dorothy what had happened to the wooden box. She said that Reverend Carter had taken it, had buried it in the old slave cemetery, and had sworn never to speak of it again. The Reverend had died in 1911, taking the box's exact location to his grave. Dr. Hawthorne's research notes, archived at the University of Alabama, include his own thoughts on the case. I have investigated dozens of supposed supernatural events in my career. Most have rational explanations. Some remain mysteries simply due to lack of evidence. But the Whitlock Plantation case is different. The documentation is too extensive, the witnesses too numerous, the pattern too precise to dismiss. Either we are dealing with the most elaborate hoax in Southern history, or we must accept that something occurred there that defies our understanding of natural law. In 1978, another fragment of the story emerged. A journalist named Marcus Webb was researching the history of formerly enslaved people in Alabama for a book on Reconstruction. He tracked down Samuel Hodge's daughter, Ruth, who was 97 years old and living in a nursing home in Birmingham. Ruth had left Whitlock Plantation in 1889, before the events involving her father. She had not witnessed the prophecies or the deaths, but she had maintained contact with her mother, Eliza, through letters until Eliza's death in 1910. Ruth told Webb something that had never appeared in any other account. She said that in 1895, 4 years after Samuel's death, her mother had written to her describing a strange visit. A man had come to the plantation, claiming to be a researcher from Washington. He had asked extensive questions about Samuel, about the box, about the deaths. He had offered Eliza a substantial sum of money, an amount that would have changed her life, in exchange for any documents, objects, or information related to the case. Eliza had refused. The man had become insistent, almost threatening. He had told her that certain people wanted the matter buried, that it was dangerous for such stories to spread, that it would be better for everyone if the events at Whitlock Plantation were forgotten. Eliza had told him to leave and never return. She had then destroyed most of Samuel's papers, fearing that someone might try to take them by force. Only the few items she had hidden in the trunk, the damaged journal, the letter, the newspaper clippings, had survived. Ruth said, "My mother believed that my father had touched something powerful, something that made certain people afraid. She believed there were forces at work, both supernatural and human, that wanted the truth hidden. She spent the rest of her life protecting his memory, making sure that what he did, whatever it was, would not be completely erased from history." Marcus Webb attempted to verify the story of the mysterious visitor, but found no records. His book, published in 1980, included a chapter on Samuel Hodge, but it attracted little attention. The story remained obscure, known only to a handful of researchers and local historians. In 1995, the area where Whitlock Plantation once stood was surveyed for development. A construction crew, clearing land for a shopping center, discovered human remains. In what had been the old slave cemetery, the bones were fragmentary, scattered from at least 40 different individuals, consistent with the unmarked graves documented in historical records. Among the remains, workers found a small wooden box, badly deteriorated but still partially intact. The box was sent to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for examination. Records from the examination are sparse, but note that the box contained unidentified organic material and papers, too. Damaged to preserve or translate, the box itself was catalogued and placed in storage. 3 months later, according to internal memos obtained through a public records request, the box disappeared from the archives. No explanation was ever provided. Security footage showed no unauthorized entry. The box simply vanished from a locked, climate-controlled storage facility. The archaeologist who had initially examined the box, Dr. Patricia Vance, retired shortly after and refused to discuss the Whitlock Plantation site in any interviews. When pressed by a reporter in 1997, she would only say, "Some histories are better left buried. Some objects carry weights that we cannot measure or understand." The shopping center was never built. The development company cited unforeseen soil complications and abandoned the project. The land where Whitlock Plantation once stood remains empty to this day, slowly being reclaimed by woods and undergrowth. Local residents avoid the area, especially near the old cemetery site. There are stories of people who walk through those woods and hear voices, see shadows that do not match any physical form, feel a presence that watches and waits. Whether these are genuine supernatural phenomena, the power of suggestion, or simply the echo of historical trauma soaked so deeply into the land that it cannot be forgotten, no one can say with certainty. More than a century has passed since Samuel Hodge stood in front of his community and announced 12 deaths. The documentary evidence is fragmentary but compelling. The testimony of witnesses, while colored by the beliefs and prejudices of their time, is remarkably consistent. The deaths themselves are matters of public record, documented in county registries, newspaper accounts, and official investigations. What we are left with is a mystery that refuses easy resolution. Was Samuel Hodge a murderer? The evidence strongly suggests he was not. He had alibis for most of the deaths. He was in jail when one occurred. The manner of several deaths, spontaneous human combustion, drowning on dry land, a support beam falling at precisely the right moment, seemed to defy any possibility of human orchestration. Was he a genuine prophet, touched by forces beyond our understanding. This is what he believed, what his family believed, what many in his community believed. The accuracy of his predictions down to dates and manner of death is extraordinary. If this was guesswork, it was guesswork of an impossible precision. Or was Samuel Hodge something else entirely? A man so traumatized by the horrors of slavery, so connected to the accumulated pain of his community, that he became a conduit for forces we cannot name. Perhaps the wooden box was not magical in itself, but served as a psychological trigger, unlocking something in Samuel's mind that allowed him to access information or patterns that normally remain hidden. There is another theory, darker and more disturbing. Perhaps the deaths were not prophecy at all, but a form of mass psychogenic phenomenon. Perhaps Samuel's certainty, combined with the guilty consciences of his targets and the collective belief of the community, created a psychological environment in which people literally killed themselves through stress, fear, and unconscious self-fulfillment of the prophecies. This theory might explain deaths like Margaret Whitlock's suicide and Moses Grant's terror-induced collapse. But it struggles to account for Clara May Johnson's fall, Isaac Freeman's impossible drowning, or Thomas Whitlock's spontaneous combustion. Detective William Marsh, in his final report filed in March 1892, concluded, "This investigation has revealed no evidence of criminal activity that could be prosecuted under the laws of Alabama. The deaths appear to be the result of accident, natural causes, and coincidence, though the pattern of coincidence strains credulity. I am forced to leave this case unsolved and recommend no further action." But in his private journal, Marsh wrote something very different. "I believe I have witnessed something that exists outside the boundaries of natural law. Whether this is divine judgment, ancestral curse, or some phenomenon that science has not yet discovered, I cannot determine. What I know is this: Samuel Hodge spoke truth. The 12 died as he predicted, and I will carry the weight of this knowledge for the rest of my life, unable to explain it, unable to forget it." The Whitlock family sold the plantation in 1895 and left Alabama. The property changed hands several times over the following decades, always sold at a loss, always quickly abandoned. No development has ever successfully taken root on that land. The church where Samuel made his prophecy burned down in 1923 under mysterious circumstances. The slave cemetery where he found the box is now completely overgrown. The location of individual graves lost to time and nature. But the story persists. In African American communities throughout Jefferson County, Samuel Hodge is remembered. Some see him as a prophet, some as a cautionary tale about the dangers of disturbing the dead, some as a symbol of justice denied in life but achieved through other means. In academic circles, the case is occasionally discussed as an example of folklore, mass hysteria, or the psychological impact of historical trauma. But few researchers examine it closely. The documentation is scattered, many records have been lost or deliberately destroyed, and there seems to be an unspoken agreement that some mysteries are better left alone. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened at Whitlock Plantation in 1891 and 1892. We have the facts. 12 people died, in the exact manner predicted by a former slave who claimed to have received visions from his ancestors. We have the documentation, the witness testimony, the official investigations. What we do not have is an explanation that satisfies both our reason and our evidence. Perhaps the truth is that some events exist in a space where history, trauma, belief, and the unexplained intersect. Perhaps Samuel Hodge's story is not about choosing between rational and supernatural explanations, but about acknowledging that the legacy of slavery created wounds so deep, injustices so profound, that they generated forces beyond our normal understanding. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrifying, that there are forms of justice that operate outside human law, that the dead do not forget, and that some debts demand payment regardless of how much time has passed. The wooden box, if it still exists, remains hidden. The exact location of Samuel Hodge's grave is uncertain. The cemetery where he was buried has been destroyed by development. The voices of those who witnessed these events have been silenced by death. But the story endures, passed down through generations, whispered in the darkness, a reminder that history has weight, that suffering leaves marks that cannot be erased, and that we may never fully understand the forces that move through our world. Now I want to hear from you, our community. What do you believe happened at Whitlock Plantation? Was Samuel Hodge a prophet touched by ancestral spirits? A man driven to elaborate revenge? Or did something else occur, something that defies our categories and explanations? Share your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you think. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think, if it has unsettled you in ways you cannot quite articulate, then please consider subscribing to our channel. Click that notification bell so you never miss our journeys into the forgotten corners of history, where the unexplained waits to be discovered. We are building a community here, a community of people who understand that the past is never truly past, that history has layers we are still uncovering, that the line between documented fact and inexplicable mystery is thinner than we'd like to believe. Thank you for walking this dark path with me today. Thank you for listening to Samuel Hodge's story, for giving voice to those who history tried to silence, for sitting with the discomfort of questions that may never have answers. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the past is watching, always watching, waiting for the moment when its buried truths can finally be heard. This is our haunted community, and you are part of it now.